We're here to talk today about your book, Sprint. And this is something that, we did a lot at GV. When I was there, obviously investing in a handful of startups, you guys would go into these startups and do these things called sprints.
Yeah, so basically the idea with the sprint is to take a big problem, a big challenge that a company's facing, and clear the schedule for a week, get the team all together, so 5, 6, 7 people, and then we do this series of sort of specific steps, and by the end of the week, they've got a finished, realistic prototype, test it with 5 customers, and you kind of know what to do next. You know if the ideas are good or if they need more work. And so over the course of the last few years at GV, we experimented kind of over and over again to tweak it and try to figure out what would work predictably.
So every startup has their own set of ways of developing new products, and certainly I've been involved in a handful of brainstorming sessions. What do you think? What's different here between the sprint process that you guys run and then what most startups do, which is just getting together, talking about ideas, and then building something?
So I think there are 2 big differences. So when you and I were running a startup, for instance, I think we had 2 really common faults that you see in startups all over the place. One is you spend a whole bunch of time just talking. And so you try to reason out things. And a lot of times when you get into a heated argument, it's because you just have no data to go on. You and I would argue about users will definitely do this or users will definitely do that. And we get mad at each other and get really excited about things. And so you see lots and lots of startups just making as best I guess they can.
But isn't that the case pre-launch though? You really have no idea what users are going to run into.
Right. I mean, that is the case pre-launch, is you've got nothing to go on. And so with a sprint, in the process of a week, you go from having just these concepts of ideas to developing a realistic looking prototype. So it looks like the real product, and then testing with 5 users. And you get a lot of the benefits you would have got by launching with not launching at all and by moving much more quickly. And then the other problem you see with startups is that they're working in this kind of the agile model that you see. It's really common in the Bay Area and pretty much all over the place in startup land now. And in Agile, what you do is you choose your best bet, you build it as quickly as you can, you launch it out in the wild, and then you gather the analytics, right? I think we've all done this before, right? And it's got a bunch of pitfalls. At the beginning, you pretty much have to choose one bet. What's your best possible idea? Because it's really hard to do kind of radically different things and test them both in the market at the same time. In a sprint, you can do kind of multiple prototypes that can be very, very different from each other. And then engineering things takes longer than you ever think it will. I mean, do you ever finish projects on time?
No, it's true, yeah.
It's really frustrating, right? And then when you launch things, it's almost impossible to go back. And then when you try to measure the analytics, no matter how good your statisticians and your researchers are, the analytics are usually not as clear as you'd like them to be, and it's really hard to understand. You might know that something works or it doesn't work, but it's really, really hard to understand why it works or doesn't work.
So how do you get at that with actual individuals that you're bringing in as part of the sprint? How do you get at what's working when you only have, 5 people or 7 people?
Yeah, it's hard. It's a different kind of data. So we'll bring in 5 people and interview them one-on-one, and we'll show them something that appears realistic, but it's just kind of a facade of the product. So behind the scenes, it doesn't work. You can't go down every path with the product. But from 5 people, you can get there's some pretty good data behind the fact that you'll see the biggest sort of problems and the biggest good things. So you'll find 80% of what you'd find if you tested with 30 people doing these same kinds of interviews. You won't get that sort of large-scale quantitative data that you get from a launch, but as Daniel was saying, you kind of can understand why things work and don't work. You see people react. You hear them talk about what's going on, and that's something that even often when a product's out in the wild, you're still having to sort of argue about what the data means.
Sure. So you guys have worked with a handful of my companies I invested in while at GV, plus countless others. Can you give me some examples of companies that you've worked with and an outcome that came out of that sprint?
Yeah, you want to tell the story?
One really good one is a big project we did with Slack. And what we did with Slack was we were working on the out-of-box experience, so the new user flow. When someone has just kind of heard about Slack and then they decide maybe this is the right product for my team, and then they go to the website, they go through some steps to set up their first Slack instance, and Slack was looking at their stats, and they were really unhappy with kind of how many people were coming out the other side and developing a healthy kind of Slack community. within their company.
It's really hard because if you're the first person, you got to convince your team
Sure.
this is something we should try. It's a big hill.
And it's similar enough to other things you've seen, but it's so different from email. And that's the typical way that people are communicating internally at companies.
Were they seeing a lot of drop off at this point? Like someone installs it, they don't invite team members in, or they just don't understand the product?
It was a really bumpy path. So people would come in and they'd be excited, and then they'd see a lot of kind of up and down activity, and then certain types of users, and they could see some analytics of who turns into a health user, would eventually, a month or two later, develop a really healthy community, and then it would suddenly take off in their organization. And they wanted to tighten that up and make it more predictable. And so we worked with them on some ideas for this. And internally at Slack, there were kind of two competing ideas of what would make a great out-of-box experience. One of them was fairly complex, and it was the most popular idea within the company. And the other one was a fairly simple out-of-box experience that had nice little milestones. You do, one task, then the Slack system will tell you, okay, great, now try this other thing. Okay, great, try this other thing. And internally, there was a lot of friction about which one was the better idea. And the nice thing in a sprint is we didn't have to choose which was the better idea. We actually prototyped them both by the end of the week. So we came up with kind of concepts of how each one could go. Then we developed a prototype of the out-of-box experience. We recruited 5 people to come join us who were typical potential customers. So we're not just like grabbing people in a cafe, right? I mean, you hear this in kind of lean startup people a lot of the time. It's like, just get on the street and talk to people.
Let me ask you a question. Where do you find these people? Because you want people that are interested in the product but have not yet used it, right?
Right.
So how do you find that person?
So what we do is we set up a screener, right? And so we think, okay, who is our ideal person? In the case of Slack, you had to work on a team, right? And ideally be communicating with other people. If you're just a freelancer, or if you work, in the kind of team that wouldn't have internal communication that would benefit from Slack, say you worked at a grocery store, like people aren't emailing each other in the grocery store and collaborating on products together.
Yet.
Maybe,
No, I'm
yeah.
just kidding.
That would be a very broad market. But if you were in an architect's office, if you were in a manufacturing kind of place where you're part of the product team, those are the kinds of communities that haven't adopted Slack yet, or not as widely as in the tech world, but they're great potential customers. So we identified those kinds of companies and then came up with a list of questions that people could answer to indicate whether or not they kind of matched our criteria.
But how did you even get into those companies? Do you advertise for them?
You can throw the net in different places. So if you have a really broad consumer product, a lot of times we'll place an ad on Craigslist, and actually you'll get, in a big city, you'll get 300 people responding. You ask each person to fill out the survey, and then you've got this spreadsheet of answers. And you're not giving away what you're looking for. You're asking sort of multiple choice questions, but you can pull out of that, you can find 5 really great target customers. Sometimes if it's a more specific thing, we've done this with sort of oncologists or people who have a very specific expertise. And then usually a company has a way to find those customers.
Right.
They know in their network.
Sure.
You still want to screen, so you're sure that you're actually getting the right target customer.
Gotcha.
But you got to cast a wider net than 5 in order to get a good 5.
Okay, so you've got these customers at Slack, these 5 customers, and so you test those ideas with them, and then what was the outcome of those ideas?
Right. And so when we started the sprint, we were trying to think, how will we know if we're successful? And one of the major criteria for us was that after, say 5 or 10 minutes using the product, people could tell you how the basic functions worked and how they could express to you verbally how they might imagine using it within their company. And it was really interesting that the first idea, the really kind of complex, beautifully complex idea that was kind of percolating inside Slack, tanked. It absolutely tanked in the study. 5 out of 5 people couldn't really tell you what the product did. They couldn't really tell you how they'd use it, and they just weren't very enthused. And then the simple idea, the one that just 1 or 2 people within the company thought was brilliant, we tried that one too, and it was a roaring success. Not all of our sprints come out with such clear data, but in this case, it was clear that the idea that they would have spent 5 or 6 months engineering and then throwing a ton of marketing dollars behind would have likely been a pretty big flop. The simpler idea that only took them a few months to develop was very, very likely to be successful. And after we're finished, they refined that prototype and tested it with 5 more people. Then they launched it, and now they've run these really, really beautiful television commercials driving more people into the product, and conversions have been very, very good.
All based off of that's initial sprint that you guys did.
The sprint was the kickoff for that whole project. And I think that's an excellent way to use sprints. So if you think of it, there's all these potential ways you can go in a company, when you're developing products. And I think of sprints as a lot of the time, it's a way to kind of narrow your focus. There's this giant, spectrum of opportunity, and you can narrow which part of the spectrum holds the most potential, and then go through your typical, product development cycle.
So you guys have gone through and obviously refined this process over time. Is this something that will eventually make its way back into Google corporate? I mean, do you see some similarities there between what they're doing on the corporate side and what you guys have done at GV?
Yeah, I actually first started doing these sprints at Google, and the process refined and improved a lot at GV, largely because we could do so many repetitions with different companies. And on our team with Daniel and the rest of the partners at GV, we've sort of had a lot of different interests in experimentation and different perspectives on making it better. But the process started at Google, and they continue to run sprints. I think they're using actually now the process from the book to teach the way sprints are run at Google.
That's amazing.
I was a convert the first time we did it. So about 3 weeks, I think, after I joined GV, we did a sprint with Fitstar, so Mike Mazur's company, a friend of Kevin of mine. And we did a sprint with him, and we sat down, and at the beginning, I was still a little skeptical because, we're writing how might we notes on Post-it notes, and it felt like, we're in a big consultancy.
In Daniel's defense, because he's Canadian, he's very polite when he's skeptical. I mean, at least for a few minutes.
Right, I swear very politely. And then I realized how quickly we got to a real thing. So instead of sitting around talking a lot, which I was used to doing with product teams, we moved so quickly from talking about what we're going to do to actually doing it. So within days, we were designing a prototype, and a fairly sophisticated prototype. They're literally using a mobile phone, doing a fairly sophisticated 20-step prototype, and we're putting it in front of customers, and you're watching this research and watching users who think this is real software interacting with it, and you're like, oh my God, so where was this? I don't need to guess anymore. I can take my guesses, make them feel real, and then test them with customers. So it's such a good way of working.
Is it because there's a finite number of days that it's kind of a forcing function to make you go down a certain path and get to an actual product?
That helps a lot. I mean, it helps to have this deadline, and outsiders are showing up on Friday. So on Monday we start recruiting him, and then you're like, we'll be embarrassed, if we don't have something to show. Yeah. And then the other part is that I don't think we love steps and process, but all of the steps in there are meant to kind of take care of things that without structure will just tend to have a big winding back and forth discussion. And as humans, we're well developed to sort of defend our campsite or share information about if there's a lion at that water hole or whatever. But in terms of making prioritization, stack rank decisions about products and guessing what customers will do, we're not sophisticated about that stuff. So the methods in there kind of take out the guesswork so you can just focus on solving the problem and not try to think about what's the best way to have this conversation, or what's the best way to articulate this idea versus this idea. It's all kind of, that part's figured out. You can just get stuff done.
So, one of the things, this is broken into a 5-day sprint. Can you guys walk me through quickly each day and what it all entails?
Yeah, for sure. So the first day, your big job is to make a map of the problem. So on most teams, you've got information that's not equal from person to person to person. So somebody knows a lot about...
Who's sitting in the room, by the way, at this point?
Yeah, so you've got ideally no more than 7 people. So somewhere between 4 and 7 people.
Is that because you worry about too many cooks in the kitchen?
You don't want to have too many people. It can get unruly when you have too many ideas,
and so this
too
is
much discussion.
CEO, product people, designers primarily.
Yeah. And engineers.
And engineers.
That's one of the best parts about it. It's designers' temptation is to run away into their fancy design room and go and magically solve problems.
You guys do have fancy design rooms.
Designers can, they're not very good at solving problems in isolation, but they're very powerful, I think, in mixed teams of helping bring ideas into reality.
So at this point, is everyone kind of on an equal playing field as far as submitting ideas into the process?
Everybody will end up on Tuesday, sketching their own solution. And we want those solutions to be sort of opinionated, we want them to compete. But everyone's not on a level playing field in the sense that there's a very clear decision maker in the sprint. And you don't run the sprint unless you've got that person in the room. And you don't have to have, if it's a larger company, you don't have to have the CEO there the whole week, but there are at least key spots when she or he needs to be in the room. And that makes you not have to worry about oh, we came up with this idea sort of based on consensus, and it turns out we watered it down. You have that like opinionated, like, okay, we made the call and then we found out what worked. So on Monday, everybody's there, everybody's kind of sharing information and making a map. Here's all our customers, here's how they move through, and this is what we want to have happen. And you interview people one by one, so all the info gets out. And then you pick a target. So the decider picks like, okay, this is the spot we're going to focus on. This is like the biggest opportunity.
So give me an example in Slack's case. What was their target?
In Slack's case, we talked about different kinds of teams who might use Slack for the first time. So in different kinds of businesses, how much technology are they using? What are sort of the markers that we'll look for when we recruit? So we had to choose one kind of customer, and we wanted to make it hard for ourselves. So we looked outside of the folks who already will pick up Slack and say, oh, this makes sense to me, like, let's use this on our team. We wanted it to be challenging.
There's a few spots you could potentially focus on, because Slack's interesting to one person. So I'm the first person who joins and I would need to learn about the product. And then there's also this other opportunity that when I invite that second person to chat with, right? Because Slack's not a single player game. It's only actually gets really interesting when you invite a second player or a third player in and you start, developing your team, or you could focus on the part where 2 or 3 people think it's interesting, and now they invite 100 people to join them in the system. So there's friction in all 3 of those places. In the case of the Slack sprint, we focus on the first third of that. Okay, I'm a one player game. I need to understand the product enough to feel confident to invite player 2. But in the future, I think they should be doing sprints on those other 2 components as well. There's huge potential there.
Focus that in on something that you can kind of like say, this is the problem we're tackling, right?
Yeah, it's a huge deal, because in the rest of the week, you're not wondering, well, should we have looked at this or should we have looked at that? You're not stressing about that at all.
All right, so day 2.
Day 2, you've booted up on day 1, you're focused. On day 2, you sketch solutions. So we've got each person working quietly, individually, and I think a big difference between the way we generate ideas in a sprint and the sort of normal course of business is there's no group brainstorming. So it's independent work. And I just found in my
talking mock-ups here? Are we talking like just they're writing down their ideas?
They're writing them on paper. So and the cool thing about this is every person can do it. Almost any product that you can think of can be expressed in
you don't need to be a designer or anything like that.
Yeah, maybe there's a stick figure or 2, but it's basically text in boxes. And so those are done on paper, and they're anonymous. So that becomes important then. Yeah, so that becomes important on Wednesday, which is when we make decisions. And we put all those up, and we go through this structured critique process. And
I know this handwriting. I know
every now and again. By now I know Daniel's handwriting, but
but we're even using the same markers and the same materials intentionally to anonymize the sketches, and it works really well.
And we review them and talk about them without allowing the person who created it, and it's sort of on the honor system because it's anonymous, but that person can't make a sales pitch. So we talk about it, we go through, we time each one, so we're moving fast, and we try to bring out what's good about this, what's bad about this, without them telling us, and sort of tipping our hands, because we have to be able to figure it out.
When you say you time them, so you're, again, putting a little bit of constraint on the entire process, saying we have to move this along.
Yeah, we have to move through it fast, right? Because it's very easy to move down a rabbit hole. I haven't seen anything.
Down many a rabbit holes like that.
Yeah. And then so by the end of the day on Wednesday, we've critiqued those ideas, and then the decision maker will make the call. Like, this is the 1, 2, or 3 ideas we're going to try out. Often those compete with each other. So Thursday we're making a prototype. Sometimes we're making 2 prototypes, 3 prototypes. Well, frequently in the Slack sprint we made 2 that one of them had a fake brand name. So we've got Slack, and again we're recruiting people who weren't familiar with Slack. And then the other one, I don't know if I remember what it was called, but anyway, we try to come up with like a plausible sounding brand, a plausible looking brand. And that prototype is made, often we'll make them in like Keynote, something really simple, so that we're not going to try to make it too perfect, too precious. You talk a lot about like what that fidelity should sort of be like.
Yeah, I cornily call it the Goldilocks level of fidelity. Because if you do something that's too low a fidelity, like paper, people talk about paper prototyping a lot, at least designers do.
Wireframes.
Yeah, the problem with wireframes is that you have to suspend disbelief, right? And you're like, oh, I guess like if you did it for real, it would be kind of like that, right? And so people are reacting to or responding to what you show them, like, hey, look at this prototype and tell me what you think. And then they'll tell you what they think, but it's really colored, right?
They kind of feel like they're in this collaborative feedback session with you, and then it stops being real.
And then at the other end is making something that looks perfect. right? But the problem with making something that looks perfect is it takes you too long.
Sure.
And you also fall in love with it because you put enough effort into
Sure.
it, right? And then you're willing to kind of disregard what users say.
Right.
It's like, oh, users don't know what they're talking about.
You've
It's
invested
so
your own
beautiful.
time and energy into something. You want to keep going with it.
But in this case, we're right in the middle. So it looks like real software. So when we did like mobile prototypes with Fitstar, like it looked like a tablet app.
And this is day 4.
This is day 4. This is one
Thursday.
day. In 8 hours, we're making this like
Oh,
fairly
day 4, one day
sophisticated
of day
prototype.
4. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we know users are coming in the next day, but we're designing this software and it looks, you know,
And it's
this totally
tappable,
looks-
right? Like you make it so you can tap
totally.
through it and things like that.
It's really easy. There's so many tools today that will allow you to build something that looks real.
What
really
tools do you
fast.
guys use? What do you like?
We often use Keynote. We often use, we've used Envision, we use Marvel, what else?
Flinto.
It's like the golden age of prototyping tools. You know, I'll probably try Comet when it comes out.
Oh yeah, that's
the
the
new
Adobe.
Adobe one.
Yeah, when
looks
is that
really
coming
promising
out?
for this year.
Yeah, it
I
looks,
think I know,
looks
but I
pretty cool
can't
though.
say. Yeah, it looks so. There's all these tools, and they're really the trick is not which specific tool you use, but about being in the right mindset. You're making something that doesn't look perfect, but it looks very realistic, and get it out there as quickly as you can. If you can do that in Photoshop and then slapping it into Keynote, knock yourself out if you're that fast in Photoshop. If you're really fast in Flinto, go for that route.
So you've got that done. Day 5, you pull people in. Again, this is not a focus group.
Not a focus group.
This
Very
is
important.
One-on-one.
Yeah. So if you bring 5 people in, you talk to them at once. You've got all these weird group dynamics.
It's the worst.
I
can't believe people still do focus groups.
Yeah, focus groups are still widely done, but that's not what we're talking about. So it's 5 one-on-one interviews. So people come in and they're in a room with one person from the team who interviews them, basically shows them the prototype, sets up kind of a realistic, a realistic stage for it. So, here's an article in the New York Times talking about these new collaboration tools for the workplace. Why don't you click around and tell us what you think? And then from there, they're kind of, they click on the link of this fake article, they're using the prototypes, and then they're just kind of thinking aloud. The interviewer just kind of prompts them to think aloud as they go. Meanwhile, in another room, we're watching over, GoToMeeting or something. We're watching the video of what they're seeing. And there's nothing like creepy about this. Well, I mean, they know
Right.
that they're on video. And
So you're watching their actual screen. You're watching where they're tapping, things like that.
You're right. We can see that, and so
See both their face and what they're doing on the screen.
which is really simple. Like you're just talking about like a webcam on
Sure,
a laptop.
sure.
Or, it's easy.
It's like
Nest
a $200
cams or-
setup.
Yeah. And so the whole team watches these interviews, takes notes, and then at the end of each, person, you say, okay, what went well, what didn't go well. At the end of the day, you see patterns, and then you kind of know. I mean, this part is sort of magical when the whole team watches together. There's no argument about the interpretation because everybody saw the same things. And these patterns just jump out. Some things work quite well. You're like, oh, that thing made sense. People just
And
got
some
it.
things are really surprising where you think something's going to work well.
that
and you're
happens
like,
all the time.
oh my God, like how did we overlook that?
That happens all the time.
Yeah.
And that's actually one of the biggest reasons why we continue to want to do this is because we're wrong quite often. I mean, everybody gets wrong a lot of the time. People are unpredictable.
This is totally what you learn as you get older as a designer. I mean, I've been doing this for like almost 20 years. And like the older you get and the more you do this, the more you get confident that you just don't know. And then you look for a process where you can learn what's working and what's not working more quickly. And that's why I like sprints so much. Is like it takes off that weight of needing to be right. It's okay. Like you just don't know. Just admit you don't know. It's fine. What's that Rumsfeldian term? They know what your known unknowns are, and then just go get the answers to them.
So Jake, Daniel, thank you for being on. Sprint, the book, is out now. What's the best URL to get it at?
gv.com/sprint. You can find out all the information about the book and the process.
Awesome. This is my copy. I can keep this one?
You bet.
Yeah, sure. Pitfalls. At the beginning, you pretty much have to choose like one bet. Like what's your best possible idea? Because it's really hard to do kind of radically different things and test them both in the market at the same time. In a sprint, you can do kind of multiple prototypes that can be very, very different from each other. And then engineering things takes longer than you ever think it will. I mean, do you ever finish projects on time?
No, it's true, yeah.
It's really frustrating, right? And then when you launch things, it's almost impossible to go back. And then when you try to measure the analytics, no matter how good your statisticians and your researchers are, the analytics are usually not as clear as you'd like them to be, and it's really hard to understand. You might know that something works or it doesn't work, but it's really, really hard to understand why it works or doesn't work.
So how do you get at that with actual individuals that you're bringing in as part of the sprint? Like, how do you get at what's working when you only have, 5 people or 7 people?
Yeah, it's hard. It's a different kind of data. So we'll bring in 5 people and interview them one-on-one, and we'll show them something that appears realistic, but it's just kind of a facade of the product. So behind the scenes, it doesn't work. You can't go down every path with the product. But from 5 people, you can get, actually, there's some pretty good data behind the fact that you'll see the biggest sort of problems and the biggest good things. So you'll find 80% of what you'd find if you tested with 30 people doing these same kinds of interviews. You won't get that sort of large-scale quantitative data that you get from a launch, but as Daniel was saying, you kind of can understand why things work and don't work. You see people react, you hear them talk about what's going on, and that's something that, even often when a product's out in the wild.
As best I guess they can.
But isn't that the case pre-launch though? You really have no idea what users are going to run into.
Right, I mean, that is the case pre-launch, is you've got nothing to go on. And so with a sprint, in the process of a week, you go from having just these concepts of ideas to developing a realistic looking prototype. So it looks like the real product, and then testing with 5 users, and you get a lot of the benefits you would have got by launching with not launching at all and by moving much more quickly. And then the other problem you see with startups is that they're working in this kind of the agile model that you see. It's really common in the Bay Area and pretty much all over the place in startup land now. And in Agile, what you do is you choose your best bet, you build it as quickly as you can, you launch it out in the wild, and then you gather the analytics, right? I think we've all done this before, right? And it's got a bunch of...
So every, startup has their own set of ways of developing new products. And, certainly I've been involved in a handful of brainstorming sessions. What do you think, what's different here between the sprint process that you guys run and then what most startups do, which is just, getting together, talking about ideas, and then building something?
So I think there are 2 big differences. So when you and I were running a startup, for instance, I think we had 2 really common faults that you see in startups all over the place. One is you spend a whole bunch of time just talking. And so you try to reason out things. And a lot of times when you get into a heated argument, it's because you just have no data to go on. You and I would argue about oh, users will definitely do this or users will definitely do that. And we get mad at each other and get really excited about things. And so you see lots and lots of startups just making...
We're here to talk today about your book, Sprint. And this is something that, we did a lot at GV. When I was there, obviously investing in a handful of startups, you guys would go into these startups and do these things called sprints.
Yeah, so basically the idea with the sprint is to take a big problem, a big challenge that a company's facing, and clear the schedule for a week, get the team all together, so 5, 6, 7 people, and then we do this series of sort of specific steps, and by the end of the week, they've got a finished, realistic prototype, test it with 5 customers, and you kind of know what to do next. If the ideas are good or if they need more work. And so over the course of the last few years at GV, we experimented kind of over and over again to tweak it and try to figure out what would work predictably.